We've got somebody who, if you know him, takes this stuff incredibly seriously and shares very valuable information as if it flowed through this community like water, which it does not. So, without further ado, I'd like to present to you my friend, Mikey of MTS Farms.
So everybody, thanks, bud. How's everybody doing? So we're gonna start off with a little science experiment that everybody that wants to take a dab can participate in. So let me just explain it real quick and then we can get going on that. And while you're dabbing, I'll just tell you a little bit about myself. So what I would like you to do is set yourself up with a dab. Start this dab off 10, 15 degrees colder than you usually, or hotter, I'm sorry about that. Start this dab off 10 to 15 degrees hotter than you normally would. Take like a full half of a dab, right? See what's happening, blow that out, and then carb cap it and take yourself a full dab. And then we'll talk about the difference in what goes on there. So if you want to take a dab, take a dab. So I'm MTS, right? Mikey Toe Shoes, wearing toe shoes right now. That's where that nickname comes from. So when I was 12 years old, somebody asked me to take something down the street. I was into riding my BMX bike. I took that down the street and they gave me $5. I was just like, that was the easiest fucking money I've ever made. I would love to do that again. I continued to do that. So when I was 14, I used my birthday money. I got myself my own stuff rather than doing things for other people. I continued that when I was 16, moved out of my parents' house. I didn't really like school, didn't really like authority, and that funded my life. 12, delivering. 14, using my birthday money. 16, moving out and using that to support myself. So it's been the biggest part of my life and done way more for me than like any person, right? So it's something that I take very seriously. I'm from the East Coast. Some of you know where. I'm just leaving it at that. It's not a cool state. Up until I had something go really wrong in 2018, dude, burners, codes, like I couldn't believe people are Googling stuff. Like when I saw the first Instagram post of somebody hitting weed, I hit my buddy up, I'm like, what the fuck are you doing, bro? So it's cool coming out here, being part of this community, and that everybody is connecting over something that I had to be very secretive about my whole life. One of the things that we're gonna talk about today, or just kind of the overall goal of some of the way that I think is maximizing potentiation within the bounds of your limitations, right? So me, I told you a little bit about myself. You should understand that I'm not able to test. I'm not able to quantify. So anything that I'm telling you is from personal feedback, end user feedback, market feedback, right? I can't tell you what the terpenes were before and after a test because that's not something that's available to me. So, see how we're doing on those dabs, right? See some people dabbing. So we're gonna talk about that. What's going on is that when you first start that dab, you're not getting much vapor. You're not getting much vapor because there's been no pressure change, right? Once you put that carb cap on, you're creating an area of low pressure. That's changing the boiling points, and that's allowing you to create much more vapor at a much lower boiling point. The oil's not getting hotter, just the physics of it are changing. That's gonna be important in our jar tech talk today, okay? So that's just a basic concept. I want you to think about that, and that, you know, pressure changes boiling points. So let's talk about why jar tech, because I think lots of people get this one wrong. A lot of people are thinking that they should just take their junk and try to turn it into something a little bit better by throwing it into an oven. I think that's the opposite. To me, if you're putting stuff with a lot of contaminant in, stuff that's been oxidized, and then heating that for a longer period of time, bad creates more bad. You're looking for a very clean solution. So it's to improve the aesthetics of it and to improve the shelf life, right? So you can improve the look of something that comes out in the cure really, really dry. If it's chalky, if it's ugly, if it's hard to get on the dabber because it's constantly falling off, the end user doesn't like that, right? And so your supply chain. If you like to keep your stuff cold, fresh press, all of that stuff, right? Even cold cure. It's not good for it to be really hot. This stuff has already been heated. So if your supply chain sucks and you're not able to keep stuff cold, this is a good option for helping it improve shelf stability long term. So when somebody buys it 2-3 months later, as can happen in the market, if stuff has to go through testing and all the different processes, that may be a better experience than a different consistency. One thing about shipping is you're usually creating a terp separation. So it is something that you need to keep flat versus some cold cure doesn't need to be kept as flat. Yeah, so it looks cool, no need to refrigerate, and ease of dab. Possibly you can improve the smoothness. If it's something that tends to have a lot of fats and waxes, sometimes that will improve that. Sometimes it'll make it more harsh. All of this requires a lot of R&D. Every cultivar is different. We're gonna talk about all of those differences, what I look for, what I found to be good, what I found to be bad. So we talked about some of the good things, some of the bad things. So you're going to have some loss, maybe 3 to 5%. That's about an average that I see. There's a slight amount of decarb that's happening. You're getting some off-gassing. So you will have a little bit of loss in this process, even though it's a sealed jar. It can be harder to package. So, if you have something that's cold cure, slides off your tool really easily, you can kind of get in a rhythm of like knowing what a gram scoop looks like and be able to package a lot faster. This is, diamonds and sauce, sugary BHO, like you're looking at the same thing. So it can be a little bit harder to package. It requires additional equipment, right? So you can do this pretty cheap. You can just use an oven at your house. You can use a reptile incubator. You can use a heat mat. To do it right, in my opinion, you want a scientific oven for the long-term heating of it. I don't use one of those as a generality for the initial heat, but if you are heating larger jars, I would recommend a scientific oven if you're doing batches over 4 ounces. Heating them up a little bit slower because you're trying to heat the solution at a more similar rate. You're not trying to just kind of decarb the outside and then you're left with this gooey stuff and you're mixing it together. The best you're coming out with that is a wet batter. You're definitely not going to get that kind of nucleation and separation that you're looking for. So if you're just taking your bad spectrums, like your 40 through 70 can be fine, but if it's really green and ugly and that's something that's coming out dry, it's definitely going to taste worse if you heat tech it than just letting it cold cure. You're putting all those, bad volatiles in a jar and just cooking them in with your other stuff. It's not good. Same thing with your 150 and up. That tends to have a lot of plant material in it. When you press that out, if it's a really clean press, you may be able to use like your 150 to 180. But if you're going all the way from 150 to 220, it's probably going to have too much contaminant, and that's going to lead to a bad taste. You don't want to just improve the look and ruin the taste for the end user, because you want someone that's coming back, right? So you want the entirety of the experience to be good. So overall, doing jar tech has to elevate the experience, not just make it look better on Instagram. Also, those bad spectrums with too many impurities, they don't nucleate well. So something that can happen is they can turn out really soupy. And like, it's nice to have a wet batter. It's not nice to have like this really soupy stuff that you can't even get onto a dabber. So again, you were going for a more cleaner solution. And that is one of the negative things that can happen from heat tech. So when is it appropriate? Again, that's a clean solution. So you're looking in your indoor, I really like 70 through 150 for your first like 60 to 70% of your washes, right? So if you do 4 washes, your first 3 washes, fine. Your last wash, I wouldn't do it unless you're trying to do a batter. It's not going to nucleate well. The consistencies that you're looking for, right? So you're looking for wet but not soupy. If you have something that's coming out that's already really, that custardy cold cure, why would you heat tech that, right? It's beautiful consistency. You're looking for natural crystallization within the jar when you cold cure it. So you know how every once in a while, when you just cold cure something and you're running your tool through it, you're like, this looks like it's sugared on its own. That is an excellent indication that's going to do really, really well in jar tech. The stuff that comes out to like the really custardy on its own, again, I don't quantify, so I don't know if it's fats, waxes, lipids, what's in there, but that tends to not nucleate well. Whatever that is that's in there, you want something that's more wet, naturally sugaring on its own though. So to me, that's high THC, plus you have the terpenes in there, and the terpenes are going to act as a solvent since you're not using a solvent. So, terps that stain rigs are great. Because what this is telling you is that when I take this dab, right, I'm heating it, it's making it through the rig, into my lungs, it's tasting, it's also sticking to the rig, maybe it smell like the water will smell like that, exception being tangy, right? Mimosa and that stuff. So, as a generality, stuff that sticks through the heat is stuff that is going to do well with heat, right? If it smells really good in a jar and you take a dab and you get almost no flavor off of it, that's something that's probably not going to do well with heat tech. Those terps are probably going to get ruined.
Why don't you think the orange terps do that?
Okay, and let's talk about the orange terps. So, first of all, I hate orange terps, so I'm super biased. Any sort of bitter orange, I really, really dislike. That's right, brother. If you can give me some like super sweet syrupy orange, I can be okay with that. But like your mimosas, your really dry tangies, they're not great. Here's the deal with them. They tend to come out dark, right? You don't want stuff that's naturally dark. Even if you pull those early in rosin, often dark. BHO, often dark. Even the BHO, I'm told by producers, has a harder time nucleating with tangy type terps. So like, even in BHO, it's harder for them. You certainly don't want to do it in solventless, where you're working with a way lower solvent ratio because you're only using the natural terpenes in there as the solvents, right? We're not jamming it full of gas. So just as a generality, orange terps do not work well for this process. When you heat tech those, they look really old, really dark, and just gross. And that's tangy in a nutshell.
They taste good.
So, okay, and you're welcome to like what you like, huh?
These ones look good too. They don't look old and gross, they got that nasty orange taste to it.
You can change your mind.
Anyone can try to change my mind on that. One thing that I will say about those types of terps as well is you often get a separation, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, but it's really important that the trichomes are developing at the same rate. I've known, like I did Citrus Palisades for a while, and that was a very mimosa heavy cut. And what I noticed on that is that I had a lot of amber really on the leaves, not necessarily the buds themselves. And we'll talk about why you do not want amber disc cells within your solution. So that is when it's best, really strong smell, leaves a lingering taste in your mouth when dabbed, except for tangy, unless, go ahead, try to change my mind. We'll talk about it.
It's not fancy. It's not fancy.
Okay, any orange terps. But when is it worst? So this is actually where I was gonna get to this. Orange terps bad. Fuck tangy, fuck mimosa. I also don't like lemon, but you do what you want with that. Sorry, and everybody likes what they like. I've been finding that out as we're judging, that like we have some very different opinions on terps. East Coast, maybe. So bad spectrums of bags, right? If you press it out and it looks green within that jar, do not use that. Lots of plant material, do not use that. Overall green color, do not use that. Yeah, cured rosin that is extremely darker than the other ones, right? So if like I press my stuff out like I do my 40 through 70 separate, I do my premium spectrum separate, and then I do my other ones separate. Sometimes I will jar tech some of those, sometimes I won't. If they all come out looking very similar, and it doesn't have green, but one is way darker, as a generality, that will come out with a worse taste if you heat tech that. So you're welcome to try it, and maybe your budget, you may not care. It may be helpful to do that R&D for yourself. This is all an R&D process. What I'm telling you is just what I've found. Everything that I've been working with is premium indoor, right? It's LED grown in living soil, mostly fed teas. Some of it was fed a little bit of salts, but very, very meticulously cared for. So if you're running outdoor, these spectrums that I'm talking about are going to be different for you. You know, you may only be using your 90 through 120 for outdoor because the other ones may have too much contaminant into them, and it's just going to turn into a brown soup if you heat tech it, right? So if it's really, really dry, and that is going to be a really terrible thing for your end user, and you want to batter it up a little bit, you can batter it up a little bit as long as it doesn't lose the terps. Just know that you're not going to get good nucleation out of a bad solution. You're not going to get crystals. It's not going to look great. I don't like doing it with dried.
You mentioned indoor to outdoor. Do you have a preference, or do you, in your experience, do you find one makes a better hash than the other?
The indoor to outdoor debate is, you know, we could go on about that one for forever. I've had great stuff from both. I've had great stuff from Living Soil. I've had great stuff from K&F. I've had great stuff from Salts. I'm not picky. If you grow your stuff with love and you are very meticulous about what you do, I think you can do great in any environment. I think outdoor tends to have a little bit more dust, and you may get more particulate in your solution or contaminant that you do not want. So it may be a little bit harder for outdoor to come out well with heat tech. But overall, if you're just talking about resin, I love me some sun grown, I love me some indoor. I'm not picky except for my weird terp thing. And I don't like heavy sativas. I am picky. You are correct. I was lying. Okay, so when to harvest. To me, this is very important. So if you've ever seen the pictures of trichomes really up close, you'll notice that there's a different coloration from the disc cells and then the fluids and the oils above it, right? So as those heads are maturing, the disc cells on the bottom, as they start to oxidize and deteriorate, those are what's turning amber, and then the reflection, whatever, you get what I'm saying. Thank you. The light coming up, right, is what makes them look overall amber. But that's actually these collection of cells on the bottom right above the abscission where you're getting it to separate, right? So you don't want oxidation within the solution. You want the maximum amount of like whitish, cloudy heads that you can get with the minimum amount of amber. If I see anything over 2 to 3% amber, like to me that was pulled too late. And everything that I'm talking about is specific for jar tech, right? If you're cold curing, I go a little bit deeper. I don't mind a few more amber decels in there. But again, you're trying to create these beautiful crystals within the solution. The cleaner the solution, the easier that is to do. Don't pull super, super early though. Don't pull when everything is clear. Also not good. You may be able to make something cool looking out of that. It's not gonna hit. You know, we all know what pulled early stuff is like. It can look beautiful. You know, if you're only going for a look and you want to be really pleasing on Instagram, that's a great way to make sure that your jar tech does come out with a beautiful color. If you pull stuff at like day 45 and jar tech that, it's probably going to be a pretty clean solution as far as indoor goes, and it's probably going to look really good on Instagram. It's not going to hit good. You know, maybe the terps are there, maybe they're not. I don't recommend doing that, but if you're just going for an aesthetic look, sure. As far as the material, Q went over some stuff pretty well. I think Colin did as well. So, you know, just being really careful about maximizing the access to trichomes while minimizing plant material. You know, that's the main thing when you're harvesting for jar tech, is that you want to minimize that plant material, like extra cuts, right? So all those extra little cuts can create little pieces that can end up as contaminant in your washes. So just be very mindful about not causing extra plant contaminant. When washing, everybody has their own ideas on washing, and again, you're going to maximize the potentiation within your setup. Some of us are washing in a cold room, some of us aren't. Some of us are hand washing, some of us are washing with $40,000 machines. You know your setup best. What I would tell you is just try to wash for the washes that you're going to use for jar tech in a way that creates the least amount of stalks in the wash. You're trying to just pull the heads, you're not trying to beat up the material, right? Again, clean solution, that's a big idea here. For freeze drying, right? So there's lots of talk about freeze drying. We all have different ideas on it. Most of us do use a harvest rate. Just, you know, money, markets, licensing, all that stuff. Sometimes it's not that easy to spend 17K on the record or 20K or whatever the next step up from those is, right? So within those, mine usually gets to around 250 millitorr. We're talking about pressure and the way that changes boiling points, right? So a lot of people think, well, 32 degrees, freezing water, all this stuff, like my shelf temp should be above 32 degrees. At least that's how I thought when I first started freeze drying. Then I learned more about the physics, and so you're sublimating, which is a phase change. So you're taking that right from a solid to a vapor. So the point at which that occurs at -20, or the point that occurs at 250 millitorr, which is like an average, something that you might get on a freeze dryer, is -24 degrees. You'll sublimate water out of there. So I run a 20 degree shelf temp, which is 44 degrees or whatever more than I need to, right? I've heard people recommend as low as 5. I don't recommend that. To me, it's going to take way too long to dry. And if you have anything that's on the edge of greasy, that's hard to sift. Like if you ever washed Capsca Mac 1, that's something that's super hard to sift. It greases up really, really easy on you, right? That's going to be hard to handle if you're going really low on your freeze dryer temp. But going lower on your freeze dryer temp will help preserve your terpenes, which is really good because they're acting as your solvent. So what I recommend I use a medium pharma freeze dryer unit. I generally don't have over 400 grams total in it. And I use 20 degrees at 10 hours and 15 minutes final dry time. Every now and then in my 40 to 70 U, because I find that compacts a little bit more between the heads, there's not enough room for the water to sublimate out as fast as the other bags. Sometimes my 40 will still have a little bit of water in it. So I just sift that, and anything that stays in the sift, I just throw back in the freeze dryer. If it's a larger amount, usually it's a very, very small amount, I'll just throw that in the freezer and let it actually dry itself in the freezer, and then press that into a little traditional for one of my buddies.
Are you always using the time, or are you using the moisture sense?
So, I mean, it's using the moisture sense, but then you can set your final dry time. If you press that little top left button on your screen, it will go into options. And the model that I have, I think it's like the 4.1 or 4.0. That one does allow you to change just your shelf temperature and then your final dry time as the only two options. I believe you can hold on longer and get more in depth with those or change them permanently. But you know, that's freeze dryer talk. So, but yeah, so that's what I recommend is 20 degrees at 10 hours and 15 minutes. And again, this is different for everyone. All of your harvest rights, you know, they all have their own temperament. They're all going to act a little bit different. So you're going to have to play around with this for yourself. Depends on if you're in a cold room or not. If your cold room has moisture in it, that's also going to be an issue if you're going really low on your shelf temps, because any bit of that moisture coming back in is going to make it hard to sift, but it's going to make it really terpy for making your solutions.
I almost feel like sometimes sifting isn't even worth the effort, right? Do you feel the same way, or?
I think sifting is definitely really worth the effort if you're going lower on your on your shelf temps to make sure that everything is actually dry. You know, so if it's something that's really greasy, you have to just chop it really quickly and make sure it's dry that way. But you know, those really greasy on the edge strains, like that's up to you. How cold is your cold room? How dehumidified is it? Like mine's in a basement. I deal with humidity. I have to work fast as hell. I keep a dehumidifier on the whole time. I know people will tell you that you can't run dehumidifiers in cold rooms. I've run mine at 38 degrees for weeks on end. And it was just like a high sense from Lowe's. Like I didn't throw an Andin or a Quest or anything in the cold room. And it's been in there for years and it still hasn't broken, where other ones in the house of the same brand have broken. So like, don't let people tell you that you can't run one there. It's just if you're going down to 32 degrees, you're probably gonna experience issues. But if you're up at 40, you can run a DQ. Any other questions before we keep going?
Have you, with your playing with the harvest rate more than Colin's playing with like the other brand, so have you experienced more differences with your vacuum Like, you have differences?
Yeah, I've experienced vast differences with my vacuum pressure. In fact, I had a huge issue where my vacuum pressure couldn't get below 550 for a long time. I went through it for like 2.5 months with Harvest Right. I would like to go throw that machine through their window. We never really figured out what it is, but if I run it without any of the covers on it, like we checked all the seals, I bought parts, I changed stuff out, eventually it started working a little bit better. If I run it with only the front panels on and all of the back panels off and a fan pointed at the condenser, it works really, really well. So, yeah, I mean, you know, they're temperamental. You get them to work as you can. I have an extra large one just sitting brand new. Mine works for now. I'm building a new, more professional lab, and that one will go in that one. But yeah. So, and I've experienced, it used to run around 400. Now it's running down at 250. I used to have it go down below 200. Shelf temp is dependent on how much Millitor it's pulling, right? Just like that dab that some of you did, right? Not much vapor. You create different vacuum. You create more vapor. It's the same thing. So, you know, and some of these volatile terpenes have a pretty low boiling point as well. I think limonene is one of the first ones to go, so it's not bad, but rest of them we want to keep. All right. So, and then after you pull it out, right, you're going to press it and collect it into a jar. If you haven't worked with this cultivar before, I really like to cure stuff out before I just throw jar tech at it, right? Every time you should do an R&D run. If you're not quite sure, throw the rest of your hash in your freezer, press a little bit of it out in each spectrum and see what you're working with. Take a dab of each, see how those terpenes last through the dab. Like you should do R&D before you do jar tech, because I would say at a maximum, 30% of cultivars are good for jar tech. I would say at a minimum 5%, but definitely not even half. So and again, if it's coming out to a beautiful wet batter and cold cure, why would you jar tech that, right? If it's coming out sugary and like with that little bit of natural BHOE look, and you want to enhance that, and it has that terp retention, hell yeah, then get at it, right? Yeah.
So can you just like heat cure at any point? Like you can fully cure it out, see how it turns out, and then just like throw it back in, no issue?
You can. The most optimum is going to be before, you know, things are volatilizing and oxidizing and doing things within that jar as it's curing. The fresh solution is going to be your best, but you can definitely do it once you've cured that out. It's just not optimal. So you're gonna be collecting the jars. There's tons of argument on this, whether you should use ball jars or U-line jars, and you know, if the tops of those are okay to heat or not. So ball jars, the regular lids that come with them are supposed to be fine to about 210 degrees. Maybe that's the heat you're using, maybe that's not. We're gonna talk about that portion in a minute. They do sell silicone lined extra lids made of stainless steel for the ball jars. They're supposed to hold slightly more pressure. Whether they do or not, I'm not quite sure. But that can handle more heat than a PVC lined U-line jar. The U-line jars are fine to 240 in my opinion. They're probably rated around the same as a ball jar. It is a PVC seal. The difference between the two is the pressure that they'll hold, in my opinion. So as a generality, ball jars are designed to hold a maximum of 6 pounds of pressure. To get optimal diamond formation, you're looking for 10 pounds in the salt once you've heated it, right? So the U-lines, in my opinion, just from, again, I'm not quantifying this by measuring it, but just what I've seen coming out of the jars are holding 8 to 9. Sometimes you can get 10 out of them, sometimes you can't. What you can do is press on the top of the jar a little bit after you've heated it, and you can get a feel. You'll know if you've been able to keep your pressure in there or not. It's very important that you keep your pressure. Why is it very important that you keep your pressure? Because of that exact same thing with the dabs, right? So when you're creating low pressure, you're changing the boiling points, so that way it's boiling easier. So that way things are off-gassing easier, so you're creating more vapor. When you're increasing the pressure, the opposite of that is happening, right? You're lowering the boiling points. That means that I'm able to heat these things much hotter, without having them vaporize and off-gas, right? So that's why we want to build up that pressure in that jar. That's going to help preserve the terps. So again, I prefer U-line. It's up to you. I think you can get a little bit more better nucleation in the U-line jars. No one has come up with the 100% effective solution to this issue, but it's, maybe somebody will develop a product, we'll see. Oh, one more thing about the freeze drying. If you're scooping big patties, those are going to dry unevenly. We're trying to, you're hitting your phase change to where you're getting the sublimation, and then from there it should be staying pretty flat until you've sublimated all the water out, and then after that you're going to start to volatilize off the terpenes and some of the things that you want to retain. The lower shelf temperature should help with that. Also making sure that you have an even slurry solution of hash and water going into there. So like your thin milkshake, your thin pancake batter, however you want to think about that, you do not want to see clumps in that tray. That's bad for evenly freeze drying. Okay, actually we do have this. So the diamond miner, right? A lot of people talk about this. If you've seen videos from the Bryantist lately, he's been playing around with this. What you're seeing is a open 1 to 2, maybe even 4 ounce jar and a giant diamond miner that they're increasing the pressure on. They are not using a lid on this. I cannot understand why. One thing is that you're getting a saturation within that jar of what's able to off-gas. Why would you want to saturate an entire container? Why would you want to saturate an entire container with a very small amount of solution? I think the reason that they do this is because they need it up in the viewing window. One of the main things about doing this correctly, and we're going to talk about this during the process, is it's a visual thing. I can't tell you a certain temperature and a certain time and have you pull it and it be correct. You have to do this visually. There's no other way that I've personally found for it to be accurate. There's like a little art to it, and you'll develop that art. I'm just trying to give you all the information so you can develop that art. So my solution, right? I don't understand why these guys aren't doing the exact same thing. If you're able to put the entirety of that into an oven, heat it to the degrees that you would like it heated, keep the lid on there, right? Then you're still keeping that saturation of those things within the jar, but then the external pressure around the jar is able to maintain that 10 PSI. So to me, that is the most effective solution. And then you can have all of the jars in that viewing window. Each jar is going to have a slightly different amount in it, right? So each one of those jars, in my opinion, will need to be pulled at a slightly different time. Now you can pull them at different times and still come out with different consistencies by changing the secondary heating, right? So use the first heat and then use the second heat. We'll talk about that. So we went through micron ranges. One thing that I'll talk about is when you're pulling your 40 through 70, using the coldest water that you can, a really, really high pressure sprayer. I mean, not a power washer, but like definitely high pressure, and spraying the living shit out of that 40 through 70. Because a lot of times if you do that, you can clean that greenness out of there and come out with something that looks good, but you'll often have more waxes in that 40 through 70, and it'll come out kind of that drier, uglier looking stuff. And that's perfect to do a wet batter on. It's not great for nucleating into diamonds. Sometimes it will, sometimes it won't. But even if you miss on that, if you clean that up really well in those bags, if you miss on it, you just turn it into wet batter rather than diamonds. But if you leave all that green in there, again, we've talked about that. So this came up earlier, but again, I want to reiterate, do a small amount of R&D testing first before you throw things into jar tech. Like if you're throwing 2 ounces in there, depending on the state that you're in, that could be a hell of a lot of money. Like if you grew that indoors and you're in a very restricted market, you don't want to just do that. So test everything first, make sure it meets all the requirements and all the prerequisites. If anything cures out dark, it's just gonna get darker. So, you want something that cures out on the lighter side. Yeah, sugary is best. Even if it's a dry sugar. So there was one cultivar that I ran for a while, which is Pure Michigan. And this stuff came out like a dry BHO sugar, no matter how long you manipulate it with a tool. There was no battering that would occur. Like you couldn't get even into the loosest clumps. It was really, really strange. I attributed that to super high THC because that was the type of high it gave you. It was like doubting diamonds. It was weird. But it had a really strong terp smell to it, even though looking at what was happening in there, it didn't show a lot of terpenes. So that was something that came out really awesome. But if you're dealing with something that's really high in THC or appears to be really high in THC and has a low terpene amount, you're going to need to take that a little bit further because those terpenes that are in there that are acting as solvents, you have less of them, right? So your little line that you can pull down on is going to be a smaller edge for getting it to diamond out well. You can definitely turn it into like a sugary BHO-y looking thing, but to actually get the faucets, the little bit bigger crystals that you're looking for, you're gonna wanna take that a little bit further than something that's very terpy. Again, chalky is not bad. You can remove some of that chalkiness. I just did a Sunday driver run that came out really chalky and the diamonds were amazing. If anyone saw any of that on my story, really good looking stuff. Fatty. And again, I'm not testing any of this, so I don't know if it's fats and lipids, but stuff that comes out really custardy and has like no hints of anything that's not really smooth when you're running that tool through it, that's not going to nucleate well in my opinion. What I've been told is that for nucleation, you need at least a 60% THC rate in that solution. And without that, you won't get nucleation. So you may be slightly decarbing as you're heating some of this, but you cannot go too far on that decarb. So it is a fine line, it's an art. Yeah, so the only reason to do it if it's not going to nucleate well is if it has a really good terp retention and it's dry. So ovens, right? For the initial heating of the oven, you can use a whole bunch of different things. You can use a toaster oven, you can use a conventional oven. If you're doing up to 2 ounces, I would say that the best possible thing that you can use is a scientific convection oven. Lots of companies sell those, BVV, AI, Cascade. So lots of different options there. Yes?
Why don't you like to use a vacuum oven?
So I actually do like to use a vacuum oven if I'm doing over 2 ounces because they heat slower. So when you're doing a larger solution, if you're applying the heat too rapidly, what's going to happen is you're going to basically decarb the outside of that and be stuck with stuff that's like a runny distillate on the outside and then just a cured rosin on the inside. The only thing that will come out to is a batter. So the scientific ovens that are non-convection, they're heating much slower, and that's actually an excellent option for those. So, but on the smaller jars, like if you have I'm talking about the size of the jar, right? So 1 ounce jar, a 2 ounce jar, you're filling it about 2/3 of the way. If you're using a 1 or a 2 ounce jar, I don't recommend that because it takes so long to heat. If you want to sit there for 2 hours, certainly can.
Have you ever tried using a CC fat?
No, and I don't like that. Yeah, I just don't like it. You've already sucked all the water out of it. I know they're in jars. I know you put in bags. I know you vacuum it. I don't like just sticking it in water. 2, you want it very flat. 3, you want to be able to see the solution really well. 4, I don't like it. So you can use the convection style for up to a 2 ounce jar. If you're going with bigger jars, I do recommend the scientific ovens. And we all know the BHO market is tanked, right? These ovens are everywhere. Just talk to anybody that's like in a heavy BHO area, and someone will have an oven that you can buy dirt cheap or get for free for sure. Probably a couple of them, right? So long-term, you have multiple options. The worst one, but one of the cheapest options that most of us have are a heat mat. So, when you're starting seedlings, doing your clones, blah, 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 we all probably have a heat mat laying around, seedling mat, whatever. you can use that. As a generality, it will just raise the temperature a little bit above the room temperature, and you're looking for very specific temperature ranges. So as far as being able to keep that solution nucleating and not just turning into kind of a mess that has some chunks in it. That really stable temperature I find is very important. So next after that, second cheapest option would be a reptile incubator. These hold the temperature really well. You know, they're pretty cheap. You can buy them for like 100, 150 bucks. It's, you know, those ovens that I'm talking about, if you're buying one new, it's like $2,000 or more. Aside from getting your free BHO ones from your friends, you know, your reptile incubator is great. So for long term, if you've heated it correctly, right, and we're going to talk about that. If you've heated it correctly, I like to nucleate in 90 degrees. If you've run it a little bit short, I like to go up to 100 because that will help change the process. But as a generality, I keep my oven at 90. Only when I fuck up do I raise it up to 100. If you're running it into basically a sugar type solution where you're not going for as large of diamonds, I would do 7 to 10 days, and the faucets that you form there should come out to a nice separated, cool looking solution. If you're going for diamonds for larger faucets for the maximum look that you can get, in my opinion, through this, I go a minimum of 2 weeks. You can go longer than that. So when you're heating it, what you're looking for, right? And you're going to have to learn this, because if I just describe it, and even if I showed you a video of it, you know, what's happening at your place and within light and everything like that, it's going to look just slightly different. So it's going to start to melt, and you're going to start to form really small bubbles on the outside. Those bubbles aren't going to move at all at first. Then slowly, the bubbles on the outside are going to slowly go up towards the top. At this point, it should mostly be starting to melt. If you're seeing that the inside is not starting to liquidize as well, and you're just getting these bubbles moving on the outside, you're heating too fast for that solution, and you're probably going to decarb it some on the outside. So back the temperature off a little bit. So as it starts to melt, right, those bubbles are going to start being really large, and then they're going to start getting smaller, right? So when it all melts, and you're still going to probably have a chunk in the center that's not completely melted, you're going to have really large bubbles, and they're going to be coming to the surface really fast. Then they're going to start to get smaller. The initial melt still has a lot of cloudiness in it. There's a secondary melt that occurs. This secondary melt looks clear, okay? So what I like to do is measure from the bottom of the jar, going up. If I'm going for a batter solution or a light sugar solution where I'm just trying to change the consistency but not really nucleate, if you have something that's dry and you want to look wet, this is what that's for, right? Just the bottom, you should be able to see all the way across the bottom at about 5 to 10% of the solution that's in the jar. As it stops that cloudiness and starts being clear, you want to pull it right then. If you're looking for it to nucleate, you're going to, I like to do about 20 to 25%. If I hit 25% where it's clear, it's gonna be mixed. It's not a fine line, right? But about the bottom quarter of it is starting to be pretty dang clear with very, very minimal cloudiness. That's where I like to pull it. Some people go 30, 35%. If you've seen Rackham's goes a little bit deeper than I do. He also tends to get less nucleation overall and gets left with something that you may use as cart tech or something like that. But he's able to get slightly bigger faucets that way. He also runs it too far a little bit. In my opinion, he would probably run it too far, too easily that way. And I like to be able to have 100% of what's in that jar left over for going in jars to be sold as dabbable things. I'm not looking for extra on the side that's going to go in vape carts. If I want to do vape carts, I'm going to do vape cart. If I want to change the consistency, I want to change the consistency. I don't want to do both of those things. So I'm looking for about 20 to 25%, and then I'm taking that right out. I'm trying to not take that into cold air. I may wrap that with like a hot pad while I'm taking it up to the oven. And then I just take that, I put it right into the oven at 90, and it sits there for 7 to 10 days or minimum of 2 weeks if you're going for the diamonds. If that goes too long, you have multiple options depending on the consistency that you get. So if you don't get nucleation, right, on day one, it should start to be a little bit cloudy towards the end of the day. Like those bubbles, as you set it in there at 90 degrees, all those bubbles will dissipate. You'll basically have no more bubbles. You may have a couple at the top. The solution will be clear with a very, very hint of cloudiness. That cloudiness should occur or should increase over the first 12 hours, and then it should be completely basically opaque, you know, unless you're shining a light directly at it, looking through there, and it should be forming a lattice within 36 hours. If after 72 hours, you still have no cloudiness, you're not getting anything back, right? You've decarbed it too much, there's going to be no nucleation that occurs. So at that point, you want to take it out and you want to see what that looks like at room temperature, right? Because right now it's hot and it's going to be more viscous. So you want to see the viscosity at room temp. If that viscosity is nice, especially if it's running, right, and you had the stuff that you made it from was dry, what you can do is you can just press some more of that out, cold cure it first. Very important that you finish the cold cure on 100% or it will renucleate when you mix the two. You mix the two, you take the really dry cold cure and the viscous stuff that you jammed that went too far, and you mix the two. I call that preserve tech, right? What's happening there is that you're getting a true cold cure, and this is something you may want to do on your own, not as a mistake, right? If you're finding those two consistencies, sometimes cold cure has a little bit better flavor retention or a little bit better high, in my opinion, and you're able to give somebody something that is a mixture of cold cure and the heat tech, as well as the heat tech. If you take it too far, all that stuff is already oxidized off, and it's in a really thick solution. Versus when you cold cure, you know, there's little pockets, there's little bubbles, right? I feel like that can oxidize a lot faster. So I feel like mixing in something that, you know, there's going to be no lattices forming is kind of sealing that cold cure in and helping to preserve it. So if you do that on purpose, we call that the preserve tech. You'll see like Cody Colson up in Canada does that. I've seen some guys down in the US do it as well. It is something that works pretty cool. So if you mess it up and it works like that, that's good. If it is just like something that would be dabbable, but it's not very viscous, you can still do the same thing. But when you cold cure the other solution, you're going to need to heat them both up to maybe 120 degrees and mix them. And it will come out with something that's a little bit stiff, but aesthetically will have that wetter look and will be easier to dab. So the only time when you've taken it too far and it comes out to like shatter, basically, right? When it comes out to like 98% disty, if you've ever messed with that stuff at like room temp, it'll flick off like it's shatter, right? At that point, it's edibles. You have nothing else to do with that. Okay, we'll talk real quick about the directional freeze. Some of you may have heard about directional freezing. One, if you have a small amount of solution in a jar and a large pocket of air above it, things transfer through close molecules. So if you place that on a frozen surface, the cold is going to come up through the bottom and that air above it is going to insulate it. So the lattice is going to form from the bottom through the top. How they make clear ice is through directional freezing because it forms from one side up and it pushes the impurities out. The idea of this is that we'll encase the terpenes in a lattice so that way you would not get separation from setting the jar there long term. The only thing is that this is for making wet batter. So like you're going to whip that into a wet batter before you do that. So some people go even further with sticking that into insulation so they really maximize the amount of directional freeze. And they tend to do that on individual gram jars. I can see no way that doing that on individual gram jars would be production friendly for anyone. If you want to do that as a hobby and spend a ridiculous amount of time individually doing jars in like a sous vide and the temperature has to be lower, you can try that. But outside of that, you know, I don't think sticking it into insulation is cool. If you take it right out of the oven and stick it into the freezer, it should precipitate out. So if you want to do a quick batter, that is another way. You don't need to wait until it does those 7 to 10 days. but you will get more terpene separation if you do the 7 to 10 days, and then you can break down any of the chunks if you want that wet batter. So it's going to be a more effective wet batter, but if you want to take it right from the oven, where you've done maybe 20% of the meltdown and stick that into a freezer, that should precipitate out, and then you can just bring that up to room temp, and you know, there's a wet batter for you after you whip it from what was previously a dry batter. Okay, so we're gonna talk about a technique, and I can't name the technique. And this falls a little bit under theory you may hear from BHO producers, and this is one that is effective. So it's different levels of filtration when you're pressing your rosin before you put it into the oven. So the only way that I know to tell you how to make something that looks very BHO looking is to heat that at least to 180 degrees. You know, if you're doing a giant jar and it's like 8 ounces in there, you might have to go at 180, so you heat that slow enough. But I can't tell you anything that's under 100 degrees to get this look other than this. I'm just going to tell you the way it was taught to me. And they did use this in a professional setting, and I can't understand how that's production friendly, but it works. So you're going to take 10 to 12 grams. And again, this has to be a very premium pull. You cannot do this with the 40 through 70. You cannot do this with third wash, first, second. But if you're talking very, very clean, what you can do is you can take 10 to 12 grams, and you can wrap those with some people say natural, some people say bleached. I was taught with a natural coffee filter. And again, this is the way I was taught. This is the way it was actually done. After that, you take a hair straightener, right? They have a specific brand that they use that's temperature controlled. And you turn it on to 180 degrees. And when it hits 180, you put that little puck that you've wrapped with your natural coffee filter in between a piece of parchment, and you squeeze it in between there. And it's really easy to break that paper. That's why you're using the hair straightener, right? Because you can feel it with your hand. So you're going to press it for 30 seconds. You're going to take that out. You're going to pull that little puck, and you're going to put it on a new piece of parchment. You're going to put it back in the hair straightener, and you're going to turn the hair straightener off, and you're going to press it for another 30 seconds. What comes out within those 30 seconds, you're then going to collect that into a jar. It's going to take a while because you're going to do a bunch of these, right? Because 10 to 12 gram presses and these little 30-second micro presses, you're not getting a ton at a time. But then after that, you can throw that into an oven at 90 degrees, and that will come out extremely BHO looking. You will have a hard terp layer separation. It will be it will be smaller sugar, but it will be very nucleated, and it will separate really well. Theory that has not been proven, but is talked about a lot. There's like Chemtech and other filtration papers. I was only ever taught this technique. But I think that you could do this on a much larger scale if you're using Chemtech style filtration paper and putting that inside of a bag and being very careful on your hand press, or so Colin's really good on the pure pressure, and that thing you can change it like 1 PSI at a time. So you may be able to accomplish that with that as well. I really like being able to feel everything. I'm a person, like I said, I don't even care about quantifying. Because science may tell me something and end user feedback may tell me something different. And I care way more about end user feedback and what I experience than what something says on a piece of paper. Because that's what people are actually going to experience. Sometimes I think we go too hard into trying to quantify everything. So dry ice preservation tech for terpenes. This is something that you need to make sure. This is why I really like the U-line jars, because they hold the pressure really well. Right, and since you're able to hold a higher PSI, you're able to hold more terpenes and everything within saturation within that air pocket. So what you're going to do is you're going to do your 2-week plus process of making your diamonds, right? And then after that, you're going to take that out from 90 degrees and set it at room temperature. You're going to set it there for a couple hours. Let it gently come down to room temp. After that, you're going to stick it in a fridge. Again, 4 to 6 hours, let it gently come down to that temperature. After that, freezer. This is usually like an overnight thing. You know, I started in the morning, it's in the freezer overnight. Next day, I take a ball jar, just the little lip lid, I flip that upside down on top of the jar, and I put dry ice on top of that. And I put that back in the freezer. Now, the one thing that's really important about this is that you've been able to maintain that pressure in the jar the entire time. So remember how I talked about pressing down on the top of it with your thumb? So press down. If you've already lost the pressure within the jar, this is useless, right? But if you maintain that pressure, what you're trying to do is get that as cold as you possibly can above the rosin. You're not trying to put the dry ice or the rosin in dry ice. I don't find it's good to go as cold as you possibly can with that rosin. But within that, you're trying to precipitate out any terpenes or positive things that we've off-gassed back down. And I find that you can get a better nose and better terp retention if you've been able to maintain that pressure. And again, all of this is cultivar dependent, grow dependent, you know. Salts may produce something different than living soil, so you're going to have to test all of this to see if it works for you. But these are the things that have worked for me. And luckily, you know, I talked about how I got here. So one thing that I'll say real quick about myself is that, you know, I was doing all this and then I became responsible for someone else's life and I took a different direction, even though I kept my hand playing over here. Out to the rest of the world, I was a very different person. And I got to be a lead design engineer for an international company. I was writing SOPs, teaching production, solving any production solutions for over 300 people in-house, as well as I had to go over to China and teach production solutions over there, write SOPs, teach them how to do things. So, and this was all working in research and development. So everything had to be very, very well done in R&D and written off and everything. So me being someone that was a dropout at 16, I normally would not have that sort of past as well. So being able to combine some of the things that I learned within that world, within my methodology of research and development to develop these things was very important. But like I said, I played in that other world and my hash making was for myself. I love rosin. It's my favorite thing, right? Melt would be my second favorite thing. I know it's a different opinion than some of you. So anyways, I smoked. We had shatter. I'm sure a lot of us have gone through this where it got to the really crappy shatter where everyone just tried to make it as strong as possible and we were all doing red hots. When that happened, I stopped dabbing. That was gross to me. I was getting throat infections all the time. I was like, fuck concentrate. So I'm not down with that, right? Every time I went and saw my homie, do our thing, right? I'm going to leave, makes me take a dab. One time, he made me do a dab before we're leaving, I blew it out. I'm like, what the fuck was that, bro? Like that feels amazing, tastes amazing. That was Grease Monkey from Rosin Only out in Colorado. Shout out him. And immediately I stopped smoking. I grabbed 10 grams for myself and I've been smoking rosin every single day since. So I got I'm an obsessive person. If my mind isn't put to good things, it's put to bad things. I need to be a psychopath about stuff, so I became a psychopath for years about this. And since I was funding myself through the other thing, where we all, I'm sure have played and funded ourselves, I didn't give a shit if I made money. I didn't give a shit if I ruined a batch. I gave a shit how much I learned. I gave a shit how good of rosin I could make for myself. I just wanted to figure out what the hell do I like the best and how do I make that? And yeah, past that, man, I look at all this stuff through the eyes of activism. Whatever, some of us like the government, some of us don't. I don't like what they do a lot. So, you know, I think that we need to be really thoughtful in the way that we approach this as everything is legalizing. I'm still in this area that sucks, and it's extreme corporatism. And I think we need to be strong of character, really truthful with the people on your team, and really build strong local communities. I know the Instagram world can be a little bit weird, but you know, if you're playing on the other side, keep things secret and be safe out there. Don't pay your taxes. All right, love you guys.